Hello and welcome to Woundup. Last week I had an opportunity to catch up with David Donovan, the managing editor of Independent Australia. David Donovan, welcome again to Woundup.
G'day Scott, always a pleasure, never a chore.
It's been a while, David, and a lot has happened.
Indeed.
Well, in the last few weeks we've had a globe-trotting Prime Minister. Was that trip successful? Was it necessary?
I think it was very successful. I think if you're classing it on how many times Tony Abbott made a gaffe, then I reckon he had a blinder. Because I reckon there was not a spot that he stopped on the map where he didn't make a complete stuff-up.
And of course, David, the big news, no pun intended, over the last couple of days has been Clive Palmer.
Big Clive, he certainly has thrown a great big dirty, greasy spanner in the works of the Liberal Party's plan to abolish the carbon tax, but I suspect that it's only delaying the inevitable.
Look, I agree, David. I think it's only a matter of time before Clive gets what Clive wants, and then we'll see the carbon tax repealed.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's a couple of ways of looking at it. It's definitely true that the carbon tax is going to be repealed. There's no doubt that Clive, one of Australia's big coal miners and iron ore producers, is going to want to get rid of that carbon tax for sure. But at the same time, I think he's just loving the fact that he's causing maximum discomfort to Tony Abbott. And look, I think while he's doing that and he's getting on the news and he's getting his rather hefty profile out there, then he's picking up new supporters. And I mean, if you look at the poll numbers in Queensland in particular, the Palmer United Party is growing at an astonishingly fast rate.
Of course, this is good news for progressive parties because, the Palmer United Party is, of course, fundamentally conservative. So their support will be taken from the other conservative parties.
Yeah, I believe that's right. Look, I mean, when you look at the recent WA half Senate by-election, the swing away from the Conservative parties was about 7%, and that went pretty much straight to Clive Palmer. And the swing away from Labor was about the same, about 7%, and that went directly to the Greens. So, I don't think Palmer's taken away too many progressive votes, but look, I think anything that adds a little bit more democracy to our sort of two-horse system is definitely worthwhile.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, any stone in the Conservative shoe is very worthwhile, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Look, it's great fun watching Erica Betts squirm, isn't it?
It's tremendous. I mean, it could be a new spectator sport.
What, torturing Erica Betts?
Oh, yes.
How ironic.
David, you did mention earlier Tony Abbott's gaffes, and I guess one of the largest gaffes, or certainly one of the gaffes that could cause him further trouble down the track, comments that he made to Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe along the lines that he respected the skill and honour with which the Japanese fought during World War II. Now, specifically, he was talking about the submariners that ventured into Sydney Harbour and Newcastle Harbour, who were killed following their attack in Sydney Harbour. But there are a lot of former prisoners of war still alive in Australia, and of course, surviving families of those that are no longer with us, who suffered terribly at the hands of the Japanese during the Second World War. I think perhaps it's just better to let these sleeping dogs lie.
Look, I think Tony Abbott, that's another gaffe. There's no doubt that many people who had relatives who, for example, may have worked on the Burma Railway line, where they were treated, quite terribly. I mean, people who had relatives in Changi prison, all those would be looking at those comments by Tony Abbott and shaking their head. Look, there's no doubt that the Japanese warriors fought with their own code of honour, but whether that would be regarded as being honourable to us, given that they didn't respect prisoners of war, I think that's pretty clear, is a very debatable point. So I think that, yes, he probably should have just said nothing about that.
Lastly, Scott Morrison and his visit to Sri Lanka. What do you make of that?
Scott Morrison, or as he's sometimes known, Scott Morrel's None. His trip over to Sri Lanka couldn't have come at a worse time, really. I mean, after turning those boats back, then he, and keeping those 153 Sri Lankan asylum seekers on a prison boat after having turned back 41 or whatever it was. It's just quite terrible, isn't it? You know, there we are giving them patrol boats so they can quite openly better stop boats from leaving Sri Lanka. I mean, there's no two ways about the fact that Sri Lanka is still in the midst of a fairly repressive regime under the Rajapaksa regime over there, where it seems like only his family members get to be in any important positions, the President Rajapaksa. And yet there we are handing over military equipment to this regime that's been accused of gross war crimes and human rights abuses. I think it's quite appalling. I can't see how we can honestly hold our head high in the international community when we're doing these sorts of acts. Our government's doing these sorts of acts.
Of course, David, it's not just handing over equipment, it's also handing over asylum seekers now.
Handing over people back to their persecutors. It's absolutely abhorrent. I mean, I know people are talking about trying to get some sort of action at The Hague. I'm not sure how realistic it is, but I definitely think it's something that needs to be considered. I mean, we're turning ourselves into international outlaws. You know, it's not nice to feel like you're the bad guy, is it?
Well, certainly not. And in fact, I have seen recently suggestions that what the Australian Navy is doing at sea constitutes piracy.
Yeah, well, that's right. Julian Burnside did say that. Well, I mean, think about it logically. I mean, I'm not an international lawyer by any stretch of the imagination, but when you take people on the high seas in boats and put them on board your own boat, then what is that? That's got to be kidnapping, hasn't it?
Oh, I would have thought so.
You know, I mean, what right do we have to go into international waters and kidnap people? You know, yes, it might have been their intention to come to Australia. It might not have. We couldn't really know until they get into our territorial waters.
David Donovan, thank you again for joining us on Wound Up.
Always a pleasure, never a chore. See you later, Scott.
For Independent Australia, that's all from Wound Up. Until next time, maintain the rage.